In 1942, a train engineer vanished on a routine run, disappearing into the fog of war. Henry Whitlock, a respected husband and father, was declared a deserter, leaving his family to carry a legacy of shame. For decades, that was the official story. Then, 78 years later, his abandoned locomotive was found, perfectly preserved and sealed away inside a forgotten mountain tunnel that wasn't on any map. But inside the rusting cab, there was no sign of a man who ran. Instead, there was evidence of sabotage and a secret cargo so dangerous it could have wiped the nearby town off the face of the earth. So what really happened that night? Was Henry Whitlock a coward who abandoned his family, or a hero who sacrificed himself to bury a truth no one was ever meant to find? Subscribe now so you won't miss similar chilling stories on our channel in the future. And tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love seeing where our audience tunes in from. The year was 1942, and the world held its breath. In the shadowed valleys of the Appalachian Mountains, the small town of Blackwood Creek felt the strain like a coiled spring. Every day, sons and husbands boarded trains, headed for ports they couldn't name, leaving behind the scent of coal smoke and the silent prayers of their families. The war was a distant thunder that rattled the windows of their small wooden houses, a constant, low hum of anxiety that permeated everything. It was a time of sacrifice, of ration books and victory gardens, a time when ordinary men were called upon to do extraordinary things. Henry Whitlock considered himself an ordinary man. At 43, his face was a roadmap of his life, etched with the fine lines of responsibility and the faint, permanent smudges of grease and coal dust that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. He was a train engineer for the Virginia-South Western Rail Line, a respected and steady hand who knew the groans and shudders of his locomotive like the sound of his own children's breathing. He was a husband to Martha, a woman whose strength was as quiet and deep as the river that cut through the valley, and a father to two young children, Samuel and Lily, who saw him as a giant who could command a monster of iron and steam. His life was built on rhythm and routine, the pre-dawn wake-up call, the kiss on Martha's cheek, the heavy clank of his lunch pail on the kitchen table, and the long, rumbling journey through the winding mountain passes. On a raw Tuesday in late October, the routine felt different. A damp, clinging fog had settled over the valley, swallowing the vibrant autumn colors and leaving the world in shades of gray. Henry stood on the porch, pulling on his thick work coat, and looked out at the ghostly shapes of the trees. He could feel the chill not just in the air, but deep in his bones. Martha stood in the doorway behind him, her arms wrapped around herself. She didn't like these foggy mornings. She said they felt like the world was holding a secret. "You'll be careful on the line, Henry?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with an unshakable thread of worry. He turned and gave her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Always am, Marty. The engine knows its own way home, even when I can't see the tracks." He kissed her one last time, a familiar, comforting gesture that suddenly felt heavy with unspoken meaning. He walked down the steps, his boots crunching on the damp gravel, and didn't look back. Had he looked back, he would have seen Martha still standing there, a silhouette against the warm kitchen light, watching until the fog consumed him entirely. The memory of that moment would become her personal ghost, haunting her for the rest of her days. Henry's final scheduled route was a simple cargo run, meant to be as routine as 1,000 others he'd completed. He was hauling timber and machine parts, supplies vital for the war effort, on a familiar stretch of track that snaked northward through the mountains. His train, number 77, was due to arrive at the rail yard in Stanton by 9 o'clock that night. But 9 o'clock came and went, the hands on the station master's clock ticking past with an indifferent finality. 10 o'clock passed, then 11. At first, the delay was dismissed. In wartime, schedules were fluid things, subject to the whims of military priorities and unforeseen holdups. But as midnight bled into the early hours of the morning, a thick, uneasy silence fell over the dispatch office. Calls were made up and down the line. No one had seen Engine 77. It was as if the train, with its 10 cars of heavy cargo and its veteran engineer, had simply steamed into the fog and dissolved into thin air. The official search was shockingly brief. In a country consumed by a global conflict, the disappearance of a single freight train was a minor problem, an administrative inconvenience. A few patrols were sent out, scanning the rails for any sign of a derailment, but the fog was a thick, impenetrable blanket. After 2 days, with no wreckage found, and no distress signals heard. The Virginia, Western, with the swift, cold logic of a corporation, made its ruling. They suggested Henry Whitlock, under the immense pressure of his duties and the anxieties of war, had suffered a breakdown. Perhaps he had rerouted the train, abandoned it, and deserted his post, his family, his life. The authorities, eager to close the case and divert resources back to the war, quickly endorsed this theory. The file on Henry Whitlock was stamped, closed, and buried under the weight of a world at war. A man's life, his reputation, his entire existence, erased by a single, convenient explanation. But in Blackwood Creek, another story began to unfold. It was a story told not in official reports, but in hushed whispers over backyard fences, in the shadowed corners of the general store, and in the pews after Sunday service. Some said Henry's train wasn't just carrying timber. They spoke of a secret cargo, something military and dangerous, something that wasn't on any official manifest. Others spoke of a bitter feud between Henry and a ruthless railroad foreman named Charles Hammond, a man known for cutting corners on safety and for his cozy relationships with powerful men. There were rumors of sabotage, of betrayal from within the rail line itself. The whispers swirled through the town like the fog on the morning Henry disappeared, a chilling counter-narrative that refused to die. The official story might have been simple, but the truth, the town seemed to know in its bones, was anything but. For the Whitlock family, the official explanation was not just a bureaucratic decision, it was a dagger to the heart. Martha refused to believe it. She knew Henry. He was not a man who ran. He was a man who stood his ground, a man whose integrity was as solid as the steel rails he rode upon. The company's story painted him as a coward, a deserter, and this was a lie she could not, would not, abide. She remembered the tension in his shoulders in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, the way he would stare into the fire at night, lost in a place she couldn't reach. He had been worried, she knew that much. He had spoken of danger on the line, of being pressured to overlook safety checks for the sake of speed, but he would never abandon his duty. He would never abandon his family. The thought was an absurdity, a cruel fiction crafted by men who needed a scapegoat. Her grief was a cold, hard stone in her chest, but beneath it burned a fire of pure, unadulterated rage. She marched down to the railroad office, her 2 small children in tow, and demanded answers. She was met with polite, condescending smiles and vague assurances. The matter was closed, they told her. It was a tragedy, of course, but it was best for everyone to move on. Martha looked into the eyes of the man behind the desk and saw not sympathy, but the cold, flat expression of someone hiding a terrible secret. She left that day with nothing but the bitter taste of injustice in her mouth. The war moved on, and so did the world. The thunder of conflict eventually faded, replaced by the booming prosperity of a new, post-war America. In Blackwood Creek, life slowly resumed its familiar rhythm. The sons and husbands who had survived came home, new families were started, and the town tried its best to forget the shadows of the past. But in the small house at the end of Oak Street, the wound never healed. The official story of Henry Whitlock, the deserter, settled over his family like a permanent shroud. Samuel and Lily grew up with a ghost for a father, their memories of him tainted by the whispers and sideways glances of a town that had been told he was a coward. They lived in a house where his name was rarely spoken, but his absence was a constant, deafening roar. For Martha, every day was a silent vigil. She carried her certainty of his innocence like a secret flame, a truth she alone was left to guard. The world might have forgotten Henry Whitlock, but she never would. She would wait, for the rest of her life if she had to, for the day the truth would finally find its way home. 78 years is a lifetime. It is long enough for empires to fall, for cities to rise from rubble, for entire generations to be born, live, and pass into memory. For 78 years, the story of Henry Whitlock had been a closed book, a tale of shame sealed with the cold finality of an official report. The fog that had swallowed his train in 1942 had never truly lifted. It had seeped into the foundations of his family, a damp, persistent chill that clung to their name. And then, in the autumn of 2020, the book was ripped open. The story began again not with the roar of a locomotive, but with the quiet sigh of dust motes dancing in a sliver of afternoon sun. Eleanor Ellie Shaw stood in the middle of her late mother's attic, a space that smelled of cedar, old paper, and a century of stored-away time. At 68, Ellie was a retired school teacher, a woman whose life had been ordered by lesson plans and the gentle ringing of bells. She was methodical, patient, and carried a quiet strength that her students had often mistaken for fragility. But now, surrounded by the carefully packed remnants of her mother Lily's life, she felt a profound sense of disorder. Each box she opened was a fresh wave of grief. Here was the chipped porcelain doll her mother had cherished as a child. There, a stack of report cards tied with a faded blue ribbon. This was the grim archaeology of loss, digging through layers of a life well lived to find the artifacts of a heart quietly broken. Her mother had rarely spoken of Henry Whitlock, the father she barely remembered. The subject was a locked room in their family home, the door sealed not by anger, but by a sorrow so deep and so old that no one dared to turn the key. Lily had lived her entire life in the shadow of a man branded a coward, and Ellie had watched that shadow dim the light in her mother's eyes for decades. Her brother, Mark, had told her to hire an estate service. "Just let them clear it out, Ellie. It's too much for you." But Ellie couldn't. It felt like a betrayal, like subcontracting the final act of love. So she spent her days in the quiet, dusty attic, sorting memories from clutter, her hands growing grimy as she sifted through the past. She was about to give up for the day, her back aching and a film of sweat on her brow, when she picked up an old leather-bound hymn book from a small wooden chest. It was her grandmother, Martha's. The leather was cracked and worn smooth at the edges, the pages filled with her grandmother's delicate, spidery script in the margins. It felt heavy, sacred. As Ellie idly fanned the brittle pages, something slipped from between the verses of Rock of Ages and fluttered to the dusty floorboards. It was a single sheet of stationery, folded into a small, tight square, yellowed with age to the color of old ivory. Her first thought was that it was a pressed flower or a forgotten note. Her fingers, stiff from the cold, fumbled as she carefully unfolded it. The paper was so fragile she was afraid it might crumble into dust. The ink was a faded brown, the cursive elegant but written with a hurried, heavy pressure, as if the writer was fighting against time. The date at the top of the page sent a jolt, like a static shock, straight to her heart. October 20th, 1942, 1 week before her grandfather vanished. Her breath caught in her throat. She sank down onto an old trunk, the hymn book forgotten in her lap, and began to read the words of a ghost. It was a letter from Henry to Martha. It wasn't long, just a few short paragraphs, but every word carried the weight of a lifetime. He wrote of his love for her and the children, familiar words that made Ellie's eyes burn with tears. But then the tone shifted. The steady, comforting prose gave way to something else, something tense and urgent. "There is danger on the line, Marty," he wrote. "More than the usual. Hammond is pushing us too hard, cutting corners that a man ought never to cut. He's got us hauling cargo that isn't on the books, and he doesn't want questions asked. The men are scared, but they're more scared of him and what the company will do to their families if they speak up." The name Hammond snagged in Ellie's memory, a half-forgotten piece of family lore. The foreman her grandmother had always spoken of with a quiet, steely hatred. Ellie's heart began to pound against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She read on, her finger tracing the faded lines. "They are asking me to do something I know is wrong, something that puts good people at risk. I cannot be a part of it. I have to make it right, for our family and for this town. Whatever happens, know that I am doing it for you. Know that I stood for what was right." He signed it simply, "Forever yours, Henry." Ellie sat there in the silence of the attic, the letter trembling in her hand. The air grew thick, heavy. 78 years of carefully constructed lies, of polite fictions and buried shame, had just been obliterated by a few lines of faded ink. This was not the letter of a man on the verge of a breakdown. This was not the rambling of a coward planning his escape. This was the testament of a man walking into a storm, a man who knew he might not walk out. "I have to make it right." The words echoed in the dusty quiet, a promise that had been silenced for nearly a century. In that moment, Ellie felt an unshakable connection to the grandfather she had never known. She felt his integrity, his fear, and his resolve, and she felt the burning, righteous anger of her grandmother, Martha, and the quiet, enduring sorrow of her mother, Lily. It was as if their spirits were there in the attic with her, urging her on, passing a torch that had been kept hidden for far too long. A quiet, methodical schoolteacher was suddenly filled with a fierce, warrior's purpose. That evening, she called her brother. Mark was a practical man, a financial advisor who dealt in numbers and probabilities, not in 78-year-old mysteries. She read him the letter over the phone, her voice shaking with the magnitude of her discovery. She expected him to be as shocked, as galvanized as she was. Instead, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was weary, exhausted. "Ellie, please," he began, his tone pleading. "Just let it go." The words were a bucket of ice water. "Let it go?" she asked, incredulous. "Mark, this changes everything. He wasn't a deserter. He was trying to stop something. He was brave. And what good does it do now?" Mark shot back, his voice rising with a frustration born of a lifetime of carrying this burden. "Mom is gone. Grandma is gone. All the people from that time, they're all gone. What are you going to do? March into Blackwood Creek and demand an apology? All you'll do is stir up a lifetime of pain for nothing. For a ghost story. Let him rest, Ellie. For God's sake, let them all rest." They argued, the raw, clumsy argument of siblings who knew exactly which buttons to push. He accused her of being selfish, of chasing fantasies instead of dealing with the practical reality of their mother's estate. She accused him of being a coward, of being too afraid to face the truth because it was easier to live with the lie. The call ended badly, with a click and a dial tone that felt as final as a slammed door. Ellie stood in her kitchen, the phone still pressed to her ear, feeling utterly and completely alone. The initial euphoria of her discovery had curdled into a bitter mix of anger and doubt. Was Mark right? Was she just chasing ghosts? Was it foolish to think she could unravel a mystery that had been buried for 3/4 of a century? She looked down at the fragile, yellowed letter on her counter. It was more than a letter. It was a plea for justice, a final request from a man whose name had been stolen from him. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't let it go. It wasn't for her. It was for Henry, the grandfather she never knew. It was for Martha, the grandmother whose faith never wavered. And most of all, it was for Lily, her mother, who deserved to have her father's honor restored, even if she wasn't here to see it. The past wasn't resting, it was screaming, and for the first time in 78 years, someone was finally listening. The 2-hour drive to Blackwood Creek was a journey backward in time. With every mile that unwound on the cracked asphalt of the old state highway, Ellie felt the polished veneer of her own life peeling away, replaced by the rugged, unfamiliar landscape of her family's origins. The rolling hills of her suburban home flattened, then buckled and rose into the ancient, stoic peaks of the Appalachians. The trees grew thicker, their branches tangling overhead to form a canopy that dappled the road in a nervous, shifting light. It was a world her mother had left behind and rarely returned to, a place that existed more in whispered stories and faded photographs than in reality. As she finally rolled into the town limits, past a rusted sign that welcomed visitors with a cheerful optimism that felt decades out of date, she understood why. Blackwood Creek was a ghost of its former self. The once bustling Main Street was a portrait of quiet decay. Paint peeled from the clapboard facades like sunburnt skin. The boarded-up eyes of storefronts stared out with a hollow, vacant gaze, and rust bled in long, weeping streaks down tin awnings. The railroad tracks that had once been the town's lifeblood were still there, but they were silent, flanked by weeds, their steel rails tarnished by years of disuse. This wasn't just a fading community, it was a town with a secret it had slowly choked on. Ellie felt a knot of cold dread tighten in her stomach. Her brother's words echoed in her ears. All you'll do is stir up a lifetime of pain for nothing. For a moment, her resolve wavered. The sheer weight of the past felt immense, suffocating. She could turn the car around, drive back to the neatly ordered world of her retirement, and leave the ghosts to their slumber. But then she pictured the letter, her grandfather's steady hand, the desperate plea to be understood. I have to make it right. No, she couldn't turn back. She parked her car in front of what used to be a 5 and dime and was now an empty lot filled with gravel and dandelions. Her first stop was the town's historical society, a small, musty room tucked into the back of the public library. Behind a cluttered desk sat a man with a kind, weathered face and a shock of unruly gray hair that seemed to have a life of its own. He looked up over his spectacles, and a slow smile of recognition spread across his face. "Eleanor Shaw? My God, is that you?" It was David Miller. She hadn't seen him since they were teenagers, before her family moved away for good. He had been a gangly, bookish boy then. Now he was a man who looked perfectly at home amongst the artifacts of a forgotten time. The reunion was a small, bright pocket of warmth in the cold uncertainty of her quest. They fell into the easy rhythm of old friends, catching up on decades of life in a matter of minutes. David, it turned out, had never left Blackwood Creek. He'd become its unofficial keeper of memories, the town historian, a role he spoke of with a mixture of pride and self-deprecating humor. When Ellie finally laid her grandmother's hymn book on his desk and showed him the letter, his demeanor shifted. The genial warmth in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, intense focus. He read the letter twice, his lips moving silently, and when he looked up, the historian had taken over. "Charles Hammond," he said, his voice low and serious. His family practically owned this town for 50 years after the war, built their fortune off the railroad. They always said he was a hard man, but a fair one. He tapped a finger on the letter. "This says otherwise." For the next 2 days, they dug. David was her guide through the labyrinth of the past, navigating dusty town archives and county ledgers with an expert's touch. They hunched over a crackling microfiche reader, scrolling through old editions of the Blackwood Creek Chronicle. The article announcing Henry's disappearance was short, clinical, and buried on page 3. It quoted a railroad official who expressed deep regret and offered the official theory of desertion due to wartime strain. There was no mention of a search, no questions asked, no hint of suspicion. It was a neat, tidy story designed to be forgotten. They found employee records from the railroad, a trove of yellowed cards detailing names and dates of service. They found Henry's file, with the word "deceased" stamped in thick red ink across his photograph, the date listed as the day he vanished. Beside it, they found Charles Hammond's file. Promotions, commendations, a glowing letter of recommendation upon his retirement in 1965. The records told a story of 2 men on divergent paths, one erased, the other lionized. But there was nothing concrete, no smoking gun, just the cold, hard facts of an official narrative that felt more and more like a carefully constructed lie. The hope that had propelled Ellie to Blackwood Creek began to fray at the edges, replaced by a dull, aching frustration. The past was a fortress, its walls built of silence and time, and she was just one woman with a single, fragile key. David, sensing her despair, suggested a change of tactic. "Official records aren't going to tell us the truth," he said, pushing away from a stack of dusty folders. "The truth, what's left of it, lives in the people who are still here." He took her to the Corner Roost, a small diner that seemed to be the town's last remaining social hub. The air was thick with the smell of fried bacon and stale coffee. In a booth by the window, a group of old men were holding court, their conversation a slow, rambling river of local gossip and half-remembered history. David introduced Ellie, and at the mention of the Whitlock name, a flicker of something, recognition, caution, pity, passed through their eyes. At first, they were reluctant to talk, their memories shrouded in the fog of decades. But as Ellie gently persisted, telling them she just wanted to understand what happened to her grandfather, the fragments began to surface. One man, his face a web of deep wrinkles, remembered the fear that gripped the town when Henry's train never arrived. "Folk were scared," he rasped. "Wartime, you know. We thought it was saboteurs, Germans." Another spoke of Hammond. "Mean as a rattlesnake, that one. He'd dock a man's pay for looking at him sideways." "My daddy worked the line," said Hammond, "treated the men like mules." Then, a third man, nursing a cup of coffee, leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There were always rumors about that last train, that it wasn't just timber it was haulin', something else, something for the government, something dangerous." The whispers confirmed the hints in her grandfather's letter, but they were still just that, whispers, shadows without substance. Ellie felt like she was chasing smoke. As they were about to leave, David had a sudden thought. "There's one more person," he said, a new urgency in his voice. "Silas Black. He worked on the tracks back then. A boy, really. Lives up on Ridge Road now. Doesn't talk to many people, but if anyone saw something." They found Silas Black on the porch of a small, weather-beaten cabin that seemed to cling to the side of the mountain. He was nearly 90, his body stooped and frail, but his eyes were as sharp and clear as the mountain air. He watched them approach with a guarded suspicion, a shotgun resting across his lap. David did the talking, explaining who Ellie was, his voice calm and respectful. Silas just listened, his gaze fixed on Ellie, studying her as if he were trying to read the lines of her face. When David finished, Silas was silent for a long, uncomfortable minute. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the last chance. Finally, the old man slowly lowered the shotgun and gestured to a pair of rickety wooden chairs. "Your granddaddy was a good man," Silas said, his voice a dry, reedy whisper. One of the only ones who was. He spoke for nearly an hour, his memories sharp and unclouded. He remembered the tension on the rail line in 1942, the fear of the men, the arrogance of Charles Hammond. And then, he told them something that made the air grow cold. "I was huntin' that night," he said, his gaze distant. "Up on the North Ridge. I was supposed to be home, but I was tracking a buck." He paused and leaned forward, his eyes locking with Ellie's. "Long after midnight, long after everyone knew the line was closed and the search was over, I heard something, a train whistle, faint, but it was there. Coming from the old spur line, the one that goes up toward the abandoned mines." His voice dropped even lower. "There ain't supposed to be no train up there. That line was shut down in the 20s, but I heard it, plain as day. One long, lonesome whistle, crying out in the dark, and then silence." Driving back down the mountain, Ellie couldn't speak. David drove in a stunned silence. The diner rumors were one thing. This was something else entirely. This was a witness, a train whistle, on a dead track, in the middle of the night. Long after the official story said Henry Whitlock and his locomotive had already vanished. The implications were staggering, terrifying. Her grandfather hadn't deserted. He hadn't crashed. He had taken his train somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. He had deliberately gone off the map. A lifetime of shame, a story of cowardice. It was all a lie, a calculated, monstrous lie. The knot of dread in her stomach had transformed into a hard, cold ball of certainty. She was no longer just correcting a historical record or restoring a family name. She was uncovering a crime, and the ghost she had been chasing was finally leading her somewhere real, somewhere dark and hidden. And for the first time, she was afraid of what she might find there. Silas Black's story was a key turning, a lock that had been rusted shut for 78 years. The abandoned spur line he'd spoken of wasn't on any modern maps, but David, with his encyclopedic knowledge of the region's past, found it on a brittle, sepia-toned survey from 1905. It was a dead-end track, a relic from a short-lived coal mining boom, snaking deep into the untamed wilderness of the North Ridge, before terminating at a series of mines that had been condemned and sealed before the First World War. The old maps called the area Widow's Peak, a name that sent a fresh chill down Ellie's spine. The next morning, under a sky the color of slate, they set out to find it. They left David's pickup truck at the end of a barely there logging road and started on foot, armed with a compass, the old map, and a pair of machetes to hack through the dense undergrowth. The forest was a wild, primeval thing. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sounds were the crunch of their boots, the frantic buzzing of insects, and the distant, mournful call of a crow. This was a place that had long since shrugged off the fleeting presence of man, a place that kept its secrets well. After 2 hours of punishing hiking, pushing through thorny thickets and scrambling over moss-covered boulders, Ellie was beginning to lose hope. The forest felt endless, a green, suffocating labyrinth. Her muscles ached, and a cold seed of doubt, planted by her brother, began to sprout in her mind. Maybe this was a fool's errand. Maybe Silas's memory was just a trick of time, a ghost story told by an old man. She was about to suggest they turn back when David, a few yards ahead of her, suddenly stopped. "Ellie," he said, his voice a hushed, reverent whisper. "Look." Through a thick curtain of tangled vines, she saw it. It wasn't much at first, just a dark, unnatural curve against the rock face of the mountain. But as they pushed aside the last of the foliage, the full picture came into view, and it stole the breath from her lungs. It was the mouth of a tunnel. The entrance was a perfect, man-made arch, hewn from the living rock, but it had been deliberately, violently sealed. A massive rock slide, far too precise and uniform to be natural, had been brought down, blocking the opening with tons of stone and earth. Time had done the rest. Trees had grown up through the rubble, their roots clawing at the stones, and a thick carpet of moss and ivy had draped itself over the scene, camouflaging it almost perfectly. Without knowing exactly where to look, you would walk right past it. It was a tomb. A shiver traced its way down Ellie's spine, a primal fear mixing with a jolt of vindicated adrenaline. This had to be it. This was where the track ended. This was where her grandfather had been headed. But why seal it? Why go to such lengths to erase it from the landscape? It was David who found the way in. To the side of the main collapse, obscured by a dense thicket of rhododendron, was a smaller opening, a fissure in the rock just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It looked like a natural cave entrance, but as they got closer, they could feel a draft of cold, stale air sighing out from the darkness within. It smelled of deep earth, of metal, of a profound and ancient stillness. David pulled a powerful flashlight from his pack. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice echoing slightly in the sudden quiet. Ellie's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to stay in the light, to turn back from this dark and forgotten place. But the image of her grandfather's face from an old photograph, kind, steady, resolute, flashed in her mind. She had come this far. She had to know. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The inside of the tunnel was like stepping into another world, another time. The air was cold and dead, the silence absolute and oppressive. The beam of David's flashlight cut a brilliant white slash through the inky blackness, revealing a scene frozen in time. The tracks were still there, two parallel lines of rusting steel stretching away into the gloom. The stone walls were slick with moisture, and long skeletal fingers of mineral deposits hung from the ceiling. They walked slowly, their footsteps unnervingly loud in the cavernous space. The tunnel curved gently, and as they rounded the bend, the flashlight beam landed on something enormous, something that didn't belong, and Ellie let out an involuntary gasp. It was the locomotive. Engine number 77. It stood there on the tracks, a massive, silent beast of iron and steel, looking as if it had simply stopped for a moment and been waiting ever since. A thick coat of dust and grime covered its black paint, and rust had begun to eat away at its edges. But otherwise, it was perfectly, miraculously preserved. It was a ghost ship, marooned in a sea of darkness. Ellie felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the past and present were collapsing in on each other. This was her grandfather's engine. This was the last place he had ever stood. She felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and touch it, to connect with the last tangible piece of him that was left in the world. With trembling legs, she walked towards it, her hand outstretched. Her fingers brushed against the cold, grimy steel of the cab. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. For 78 years, this magnificent machine had held its vigil in the dark, a silent monument to a secret no one was meant to find. David, ever the practical one, began a methodical inspection, his flashlight beam probing every inch of the engine. He climbed into the cab, the groan of the metal door echoing like a gunshot in the silence. Ellie followed, her heart pounding. The interior was a time capsule. The gauges on the control panel were frozen, their needles pointing to readings that no longer meant anything. A dented tin lunch pail sat on the engineer's seat, a humble, heartbreakingly ordinary object in this extraordinary place. But what struck Ellie with a fresh wave of horror was what wasn't there. There were no human remains, no sign of her grandfather. No bones, no tattered clothing, nothing to suggest that a man had died here. The cab was empty, pristine, as if the operator had simply stepped out for a moment and vanished. The mystery deepened, twisted into a new and more terrifying shape. He had brought the train here, but he hadn't stayed with it. A wave of nausea rolled over Ellie. Had he escaped, or had something happened to him after he'd sealed the tunnel? David's voice, sharp and urgent, cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Ellie, get over here. You need to see this." He was crouched by the open firebox, his light aimed inside. Ellie knelt beside him and peered into the darkness. Inside, lying amongst the old coal and ash, was a small, rusted metal box, a strong box. It took both of them to pry it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like straw, were several small, cylindrical objects, wrapped in oilcloth. They looked like oversized bullets or small artillery shells. Even to Ellie's untrained eye, they looked military. They looked dangerous. Suddenly, the old diner whispers about a secret cargo, the fear in her grandfather's letter. It all slammed into focus. He wasn't just hauling munitions. He was hauling them on a secret, unsanctioned route, hidden in the firebox of his engine. And then he had driven that engine into a mountain and buried it. The walk back to the truck was a blur. The discovery had left them both reeling, the adrenaline of the find replaced by a heavy, chilling understanding. They had stumbled into something far bigger than a family mystery. This was a story of military secrets, of sabotage, of a cover-up that had held for nearly a century. As they broke through the tree line and back into the gray daylight, the world felt different, altered. The quiet, fading town of Blackwood Creek suddenly seemed sinister, a place capable of hiding a monstrous truth. When news of their discovery broke, and it broke like a dam, with David making a single, cautious call to the county sheriff, the town, and soon the state, was thrown into a frenzy. News vans with satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs descended on the small community. Reporters swarmed the library, turning David into an overnight local celebrity. The sealed tunnel became a secured historical site, cordoned off with yellow tape. The discovery reignited everything. Old memories, long dormant, were stirred back to life. Painful questions that families had buried for decades were unearthed. For some, Ellie was a hero, a tenacious seeker of truth. For others, she was a troublemaker, a woman digging up graves that were best left undisturbed. The peaceful, methodical life she had known was over. She had found her grandfather's locomotive, but in doing so, she had unleashed the ghosts of 1942, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the ghosts would not be returning to their graves until the whole truth, no matter how ugly, was finally brought into the light. The fate of Henry Whitlock was still a mystery, and Ellie was now standing at the epicenter of a storm that had been gathering for 78 years. The discovery of the locomotive fractured time in Blackwood Creek. Suddenly, 1942 wasn't a distant, sepia-toned memory. It was a living, breathing presence that haunted the town's present. For Ellie, the past became a parallel reality, a world she slipped into for hours at a time, guided by David's research and the fragmented clues they unearthed. She began to see her grandfather not as a faded photograph, but as a man of flesh and blood, caught in the gears of a terrible machine. Through historical documents and newly uncovered railroad archives, the final, desperate days of Henry Whitlock began to emerge from the shadows, and the picture they painted was one of unbearable pressure and quiet, desperate courage. He was a man trapped. On one side was his duty to his country, a duty he felt in his very bones. The war effort demanded speed, efficiency, and above all, secrecy. He had been approached by military liaisons, men in crisp uniforms who didn't use words like request, and informed that his train, on its final run, would be carrying a classified shipment. It was an honor, they said, a vital contribution. He was not to log it, not to inspect it too closely, and certainly not to speak of it to anyone. The security of the nation depended on it. On the other side was his duty to his crew and his community. Henry was a meticulous engineer, a man who believed that safety wasn't a suggestion, but a sacred obligation, and he was being pressured to break every rule he had ever lived by. The central conflict, the grinding stone that was slowly pulverizing Henry's spirit, was his supervisor, Charles Hammond. In the cold, black and white print of the railroad archives, Hammond was a model of efficiency. In the memories of the men who had worked under him, he was a tyrant. Hammond saw the war not as a call to patriotic duty, but as an opportunity for personal advancement. He worshipped schedules and profit margins, and he had no patience for men like Henry Whitlock, who he saw as a stubborn, old-fashioned obstacle. Their clashes became the stuff of legend on the rail line. Ellie found a grievance report, filed by Henry just 2 weeks before he disappeared, detailing a faulty brake line on one of the timber cars. The report was formally dismissed, with a handwritten note from Hammond at the bottom. Acceptable risk. Proceed as scheduled. Ellie stared at the arrogant scrawl, her blood turning to ice. Acceptable risk. Hammond was playing God with men's lives, and her grandfather was the only one with the courage to stand in his way. The tension between them was not just professional. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews. Henry believed in protecting people. Hammond believed in protecting his own power. It was a battle between integrity and ambition, and in the chaos of wartime, ambition had all the advantages. As Ellie delved deeper into the past, she found herself confronting a chilling echo in the present. The media storm that had engulfed Blackwood Creek had also brought the Hammond family name back into the spotlight. Charles Hammond had died years ago, a wealthy and respected community pillar, but his legacy was fiercely protected by his surviving relatives, most notably his granddaughter, Evelyn Hammond. Evelyn was a formidable woman in her late 50s, the head of the county's Historical Preservation Society, a position of local influence she wielded like a weapon. She saw Ellie's investigation not as a quest for truth, but as a personal attack on her family's honor. Their first meeting was in the town hall, where Evelyn had cornered Ellie by the records office. She was impeccably dressed, her smile as sharp and cold as broken glass. "Mrs. Shaw," she began, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness, "I understand your desire for closure. But you must realize, you are dredging up a great deal of pain for families in this town. My grandfather was a patriot. He did everything he could for the war effort. These baseless accusations you're inspiring are deeply disrespectful to his memory." Ellie, taken aback by the direct assault, tried to explain that she wasn't accusing anyone, that she was simply trying to find out what happened to her own grandfather. Evelyn's smile tightened. "What happened is a matter of public record. He deserted his post. It's a tragic story, but it's the story. Some things are better left buried. You're stirring up ghosts, Mrs. Shaw. And around here, ghosts have a way of stirring back." The threat, veiled as it was unmistakable. "Leave it alone." The encounter left Ellie shaken but also strangely energized. Evelyn's defensiveness, her barely concealed hostility. It wasn't the reaction of someone confident in their family's legacy. It was the reaction of someone with something to hide. The parallel tension intensified. In the past, Ellie saw her grandfather wrestling with his conscience, trying to protect his family from the fallout of a secret he was forced to carry. He grew distant. His wife Martha later recalled in a journal entry that David unearthed. He would come home late, smelling of coal and anxiety, and just sit by the fire, his food untouched. He couldn't tell her what was wrong, and the not knowing was a torture for her. "He carries a weight I cannot see," Martha had written, her elegant script trembling with worry. "I pray to God to lift it from his shoulders, but the shadows under his eyes only grow deeper." In the present, Ellie felt the same isolation. Her brother, Mark, was still refusing to speak to her, furious that she had ignored his advice and created a media circus. He accused her of being obsessed, of sacrificing their family's privacy for a 78-year-old vendetta. "This isn't about honor, Ellie. This is about your ego," he'd yelled at her during their last explosive phone call. The accusation stung, lodging a sliver of doubt in her heart. Was he right? Was she pushing too hard, hurting the living for the sake of the dead? The pressure was immense, coming at her from all sides. The media wanted a hero or a villain. The town wanted peace. Evelyn Hammond wanted her silenced. Her own family wanted her to stop. She felt like she was standing alone against a tidal wave of resistance. Her only allies, a genial historian and the ghost of a man she'd never met. She was caught between her duty to the past and the demands of the present, and she was beginning to fear she would be crushed between the two. The truth was a dangerous thing, and she was learning that there were people, both in 1942 and in 2020, who would do anything to keep it buried. The contents of the rusted strongbox found in the Locomotive's firebox were a bombshell. The military, spurred by the media attention, reluctantly declassified a handful of 78-year-old documents, and the truth of the secret cargo was finally confirmed. The small, cylindrical objects were prototype incendiary shells, a volatile and experimental new form of munitions destined for a secret government testing facility in the north. The official transport route was supposed to be heavily guarded and bypass all major civilian areas, but Charles Hammond, in his infinite wisdom, had seen a shortcut. By routing the secret shipment on Henry Whitlock's commercial freight train, he could save time, cut costs, and earn himself a glowing commendation for efficiency from his military contacts. He had gambled with the lives of an entire town, turning Blackwood Creek into an unwitting, ticking time bomb. The revelation sent a shockwave of cold fury through the community. The older residents, who had lived through that time of fear and uncertainty, now looked at the official story of Henry Whitlock with a new, horrified understanding. He wasn't a deserter. He was a man who had been sitting on a powder keg, and he was the only one who knew it. The whispers that had circulated for decades that the disappearance was more than a simple accident had been vindicated. It was a truth that was both terrifying and, for some, deeply validating. For Ellie, the confirmation was a grim satisfaction. It aligned perfectly with the desperate tone of her grandfather's letter. He had been trapped between a secret he was ordered to keep and a danger he was morally obligated to prevent. This new information, however, only deepened the central mystery. Why the tunnel? Why go to such extraordinary lengths to hide the train? If he was trying to expose Hammond or report the danger, why not just stop the train and sound the alarm? The answer, she felt, lay with her grandmother. David managed to locate a box of Martha Whitlock's personal effects that had been in long-term storage, a box Ellie hadn't known existed. Inside, amongst neatly folded linens and yellowed photographs, was a small, leather-bound diary. It wasn't a daily journal, but a place where Martha had poured out her deepest fears and prayers. And in an entry dated the night before Henry disappeared, Ellie found the missing piece of the puzzle. Martha had written about a terrible fight they'd had, the only real fight of their marriage. She had begged him not to take the route. An instinct, a premonition of pure dread, had gripped her. "He told me it was his moral obligation," Martha wrote, her handwriting shaky and blotted with what could only be tear stains. "He said there was a rot in the line, a corruption that went deeper than just one man. He had tried to report it, to go through the proper channels, but he was blocked at every turn. They threatened him. They threatened his job, his pension. They threatened us, the children. He believed they would silence him, arrange an accident, and let the train, with its terrible cargo, roll on. He said the only way to stop it, the only way to protect the town and his family, was to make the whole thing disappear." Ellie closed the diary, her hands trembling. The sheer, terrifying weight of her grandfather's decision settled upon her. He hadn't been trying to be a hero. He had been a man with no options left. He had discovered a conspiracy, a betrayal from within the railroad itself, and the system that was supposed to uphold justice was the very system that was threatening to crush him. He couldn't go to the authorities, because the authorities were in on it. He couldn't refuse the shipment without endangering his family. He couldn't let the train continue on its path without risking a catastrophe that would have incinerated Blackwood Creek. So he chose the only path left to him. He chose to erase the problem. It was an act of incredible, desperate sacrifice. The puzzle was nearly complete, but one piece was still missing: the proof. They knew Hammond was at the center of it, but they had no hard evidence to tie him directly to the sabotage and the cover-up. It was one thing to know the truth. It was another to make it stick, especially against a family as powerful and entrenched as the Hammonds. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. An archivist at the state capitol, who had been following the story in the news, contacted David. He'd been digitizing old railroad financial ledgers from the war era and had noticed a series of irregularities, a pattern of rerouted shipments and falsified invoices, all authorized by one supervisor, Charles Hammond. The documents showed that Hammond wasn't just cutting corners for efficiency. He was actively rerouting valuable war materials to the black market, lining his own pockets while brave men were dying overseas. The secret munitions shipment was his biggest gamble yet. A high-stakes play to cover his tracks and earn the favor of powerful military figures. Henry Whitlock, with his stubborn integrity and his meticulous attention to detail, must have discovered the scheme. He wasn't just a threat to a single, dangerous shipment. He was a threat to Hammond's entire criminal enterprise, and Hammond had to silence him. The evidence was damning. It painted a portrait not of a patriot, but of a traitor, a man who had wrapped himself in the flag while actively betraying his country for profit. Here, finally, was the smoking gun. Ellie felt a surge of triumph, a fierce, burning joy that was quickly followed by a cold dread. This was a truth that had been buried for 78 years, protected by wealth, power, and silence. Unearthing it would not be without consequences. She felt as though she was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to expose a rot that had been festering at the heart of the town for generations. The story of her grandfather was no longer just a family tragedy. It was a reckoning that was long, long overdue. And she, a retired schoolteacher, was the one who was about to light the fuse. The financial ledgers were the final, damning piece of the puzzle. With the copies of the falsified invoices and rerouted shipment orders spread across the table in David's small office, Ellie felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made her dizzy. This was it, the proof. The undeniable black and white evidence of Charles Hammond's treason. For a brief, shining moment, she allowed herself to feel a sense of triumph. They had done it. They had clawed the truth out of the suffocating grip of the past. The sense of victory, however, was fleeting, replaced by a cold, heavy sense of what came next. She felt the weight of her grandfather's legacy, of her grandmother's unwavering faith, of her mother's silent sorrow, all settling on her shoulders. She had to see this through, not just for them, but for the entire town that had been fed a lie for generations. She and David spent the rest of the day carefully organizing the evidence, making copies, and preparing a formal statement to present to the county prosecutor and the media. The momentum was on their side. The story had captured the public's imagination, and now, with this new evidence, the narrative of Henry Whitlock, the forgotten hero, would finally be set in stone. That evening, Ellie left David's office feeling exhausted but exhilarated. She decided to get some dinner at the Corner Roost, the diner, now a familiar and comforting presence. The atmosphere inside was electric. The story of the locomotive was on every television screen, and the locals were talking about it with a possessive pride. They spoke of Henry Whitlock now not as a deserter, but as one of their own, a man who had stood up to corruption. Ellie felt a lump form in her throat. This was what she had wanted, to restore his name. She ordered a simple meal and sat in a booth, watching the news reports. A small, weary smile on her face. She left the diner just after 9, the air cool and crisp against her skin. The main street of Blackwood Creek was quiet, bathed in the soft, nostalgic glow of the old-fashioned streetlights. She walked to her car, which was parked in the same gravel lot she'd used on her first day in town. As she got closer, she saw something that made her steps falter. The driver's side window was shattered, a spider web of fractured glass glittering under the streetlight. Her heart leaped into her throat. A cold, metallic taste of fear filled her mouth. She ran the last few feet and peered inside. The interior was a chaotic mess. The glove compartment was hanging open. Papers were strewn across the seats. But it was the empty space on the passenger side floor that made her blood run cold. The heavy manila envelope containing all their research, the copies of the ledgers, Henry's letter, Martha's diary entries, their carefully prepared notes, was gone. Panic, sharp and blinding, seized her. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely dial David's number. When he answered, her words came out in a choked, frantic rush. "It's gone, David. They took everything, all of it." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with a shared understanding. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. This was a message. This was a warning. The triumph she had felt just hours before now seemed like a naive and foolish dream. She had underestimated the enemy. She had thought she was fighting ghosts, the lingering shadows of a long-dead man. But the rot her grandfather had spoken of, the corruption he had tried to expose, it hadn't died with Charles Hammond. It had been passed down, a dark inheritance, and its living descendants were just as ruthless as he had been. The past wasn't just echoing, it was actively, violently pushing back. In that moment, Ellie felt a crushing, overwhelming sense of defeat. History was repeating itself. Just as her grandfather had been silenced, powerful forces were now moving to silence her. The system, the network of influence and money that Hammond had built, was still in place, and it was closing in around her. The sheer, suffocating weight of it was too much. The weeks of relentless digging, the emotional toll of unearthing her family's pain, the confrontation with Evelyn Hammond, the fight with her brother, it all came crashing down on her. She felt a profound and bone-deep despair, a despair so complete it hollowed her out. Mark had been right. She had stirred up ghosts, and now they were trying to drag her down into the darkness with them. What was she even doing here? She was a retired teacher, not a detective. Who was she to think she could win a fight against a family that had been burying secrets for nearly 80 years? The town's support, which had felt so validating just hours before, now seemed fickle and meaningless. The media would move on to the next sensational story, and she would be left alone to deal with the fallout. She was crushed. The flame of righteous anger that had been driving her for weeks flickered and died, leaving only the cold, gray ash of hopelessness. She wanted to give up. She wanted to pack her bags, drive away from this cursed town, and never look back. She wanted to crawl into her quiet, orderly life and pretend none of this had ever happened. Let the Hammonds win. Let the lies stand. The fight was too big, and she was too small, too tired. She spent a sleepless night in her small motel room, staring at the ceiling. The image of the shattered car window burned into her mind. In the gray light of dawn, defeated, she began to pack her suitcase. She was folding a sweater when her gaze fell upon her mother's old Bible, which she had brought with her from the attic, more for a sense of connection than for spiritual guidance. It was resting on the nightstand, a silent, leather-bound witness to her despair. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the worn gold lettering on the cover. It was the last thing of her mother's she had yet to go through. Almost as an afterthought, a final, futile gesture, she fanned through its thin, delicate pages. And then, just as before in the attic, something slipped out. It wasn't a letter this time, but a single, small photograph, tucked into the Book of Psalms. It was a picture of her grandfather, Henry, standing proudly in front of his locomotive. On the back, in her grandmother Martha's familiar, elegant script, was a date, October 27th, 1942, the day he disappeared. And beneath the date was a single, powerful quote from the Bible verse the photo had been marking: "The truth will set you free." As Ellie stared at the words, she felt a subtle shift inside her. The despair didn't vanish, but a new feeling began to push up through it, a stubborn, resilient spark. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was something quieter, deeper. It was resolve. They could steal her research. They could break her windows. They could try to intimidate her. But they couldn't take this. They couldn't erase the truth of who her grandfather was. And in that moment, she realized, with a sudden, startling clarity, that there was one last place to look. One final, hidden message her grandfather might have left behind. A farewell note, a final confirmation, a last testament written by a man who knew he was walking toward his own end. The despair was still there, a cold, heavy stone in her gut, but now it had a purpose. It was the fuel. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The discovery inside her mother's Bible was a lifeline. Ellie didn't know what she was looking for, only that her grandmother, a woman of deep and quiet faith, would have preserved something of ultimate importance. The thought of a final letter, a farewell note, wasn't just a hope. It was a certainty that settled in her soul. She drove to David's office, the Bible resting on the seat beside her like a sacred relic. He was pacing the floor, his face etched with worry, making frantic calls to contacts at the state archives to see if any of the stolen document numbers had been flagged. When Ellie walked in, he stopped mid-sentence, the despair in his eyes mirroring her own. "They're gone, Ellie," he said, his voice flat with defeat. Whoever took them knew exactly what they were looking for. The originals, the copies, everything. "We have nothing." Ellie placed the Bible on his desk. "Maybe not everything," she said, her voice steady with a newfound fragile resolve. Together, they began the painstaking process of examining the book, page by delicate page. They held each leaf up to the light, felt for any unusual thickness, looked for any indentation or mark that was out of place. It was a slow, meticulous process, an act of faith against dwindling odds. Hours passed. The initial hope began to fade, replaced by the familiar, bitter taste of disappointment. They had reached the final pages, the maps of the Holy Land at the very back, when Ellie's finger brushed against something. The inside of the back cover, beneath the final pasted-down end paper, felt uneven. There was a subtle ridge, a faint outline that wasn't part of the binding. With the delicate touch of a surgeon, using a small letter opener, David carefully began to lift a corner of the paper. It peeled back with a dry, whispering sound, revealing a shallow, hollowed-out space that had been carved into the thick cardboard cover. And inside, folded into a tiny, tight rectangle, was a single, brittle sheet of paper. It was Henry Whitlock's final letter. The handwriting was shaky, hurried, the script of a man writing against the clock, but the words themselves were imbued with a profound and heartbreaking calm. It was written to his children, Samuel and Lily, a letter he knew they would not read for many years, a final testament from a father they would never truly know. He explained, in simple, clear language that a child could one day understand, the terrible choice he had been forced to make. He wrote of the dangerous cargo and the corruption of the men who had put it on his train. He wrote of his failed attempts to report the danger and the threats made against his family. "There are times in a man's life," he wrote, the ink slightly smeared as if by a falling tear, "when he must choose between what is easy and what is right. I could not live with myself if I allowed my fear to put this town, our home, in harm's way. I am going to take the train where no one can find it. I do not know what will happen to me after that, but I go with a clear conscience and with love for you in my heart." The letter ended with a final, devastating plea, a message sent across the abyss of time to his descendants. "If I do not return, let my children know I stood for what was right." Ellie read the words aloud, her voice breaking, the tears she had been holding back for days finally streaming down her face. This was it, the final piece, the emotional truth that no one could steal or deny. The financial ledgers were the evidence of Hammond's crime. But this letter, this was the proof of her grandfather's soul. David, his own eyes glistening, made a single phone call, not to the police, not to the media, but to the pastor of the Blackwood Creek Community Church, a man who also served as the de facto mayor of the unincorporated town. An emergency town meeting was called for that evening. The news spread like wildfire, carried on a current of hushed, urgent phone calls. The diner, the post office, the feed store, every corner of the small community buzzed with anticipation. Something was about to happen. A reckoning was coming. That night, the old church hall was filled to bursting. Every seat was taken, and people stood 3 deep along the walls, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anger, and a deep, collective grief. The air was thick with the weight of 78 years of unanswered questions. Ellie saw faces from every part of her investigation. The old men from the diner, Silas Black, sitting frail but resolute in the front row. Even Mark, her brother, who had driven down from the city, his face pale and conflicted, standing near the back. And in a pew near the front sat Evelyn Hammond, her expression a mask of cold, imperious disdain, flanked by several other members of her family. She had come to witness what she surely believed would be Ellie's final, pathetic humiliation. Ellie stood at the podium, the original letter resting on the worn wood in front of her. Her hands were trembling, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong. She didn't begin with accusations or evidence. She began with a story. She told them about her grandfather, the man she never knew, the father her mother barely remembered. She spoke of his integrity, his love for his family, his deep sense of duty, and then, her voice ringing with a righteous fury that was both her own and her grandmother's, she told them the truth. She laid it all out, the secret cargo, the rerouted shipments, the threats, the cover-up. She didn't have the ledgers, she told them, her gaze sweeping over the silent, captivated crowd. They had been stolen, an act of cowardice, designed to silence the truth one last time. A low murmur of outrage rippled through the hall. Evelyn Hammond shifted in her seat, a faint, triumphant smirk touching her lips. But they couldn't steal his voice, Ellie continued, her voice rising. They couldn't steal his final words. She picked up the letter, and she read. As Henry Whitlock's words filled the hall, a profound silence fell over the room. It was the silence of a truth so powerful, it was undeniable. The simple, heartbreaking honesty of a good man, explaining his own sacrifice cut through decades of lies and slander. Men wiped tears from their eyes with the backs of their calloused hands. Women held each other, their faces etched with a sorrow that was both fresh and ancient. When Ellie finished, the silence held for a long moment, a shared, sacred breath. And then, the anger came. It started as a low growl and quickly swelled into a roar of collective fury. All eyes turned to Evelyn Hammond. The mask of composure on her face finally cracked, replaced by a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic. She was no longer a powerful gatekeeper of history. She was the descendant of a traitor, a profiteer who had been willing to sacrifice them all. The community's anger, which had been misdirected for so long, now found its true target. People shouted, pointing, their voices thick with betrayal. "Traitor," one man yelled. "Your family lied to us for 80 years. Another cried out. The anger wasn't just for Charles Hammond. It was for the generations of his family who had benefited from his crimes, who had sat on boards and committees, who had lorded their status over a town whose trust they had so profoundly betrayed. The truth had finally come home, and it was a terrible, cleansing fire. Justice for Henry Whitlock had been denied in a court of law. But that night, in the court of public opinion, in the hearts of the people he had died to protect, his name was not only cleared, it was consecrated. He was no longer a deserter, he was a protector, he was a hero. And his reckoning, delivered by the granddaughter who had refused to let his story die, was finally, irrevocably complete. A week after the town meeting, a gentle autumn rain was falling on Blackwood Creek, washing the dust from the streets and giving the old town a clean, renewed sheen. The media storm had passed, moving on to other stories, leaving behind a community that was quietly, profoundly changed. The shame that had clung to the town's memory for nearly a century had been washed away, replaced by a solemn, deeply felt pride. The story of Henry Whitlock was no longer a ghost story whispered in the shadows. It was the town's founding myth, a testament to the quiet courage of an ordinary man. The Hammond family, stripped of their carefully constructed legacy, had retreated into a tight-lipped silence, their influence in the town shattered overnight. Justice, in the end, hadn't come from a courtroom, but from the simple, powerful act of a community reclaiming its own truth. Ellie stood at the mouth of the tunnel on Widow's Peak. The yellow police tape was gone, and in its place, a simple, hand-carved wooden sign had been erected by the townspeople. It read, "The Whitlock Tunnel, in memory of Henry Whitlock, who stood for what was right. October 27th, 1942. The entrance was still a gaping maw of darkness, but it no longer felt sinister. It felt sacred, like the entrance to a cathedral. The locomotive was still inside, a permanent monument in its stone sanctuary. Federal investigators had determined it was too risky to move the engine or its volatile cargo, so it would remain, sealed once more, a time capsule of a single, heroic act. Henry's ultimate fate remained a mystery. Whether he had perished in the wilderness after sealing the tunnel, or had been found and silenced by Hammond's men, was a question that would likely never be answered. But in a way, it no longer mattered. His final act was his testament. Ellie had made a copy of his last letter, but the original, she felt, belonged here. She had protected it in a waterproof case. And now, she walked a few feet into the cool, damp darkness of the tunnel and placed it gently on the steel rail, as close to the locomotive as she could get. It was a bridge across time, a final, whispered conversation between a grandfather and the granddaughter who had answered his call. As she stepped back into the soft, gray light, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a quiet she hadn't felt in months. It was the feeling of a promise kept. In that moment, standing there in the gentle rain, she felt the presence of the women who had come before her, the fierce, unwavering faith of her grandmother Martha, and the silent, enduring sorrow of her mother, Lily. The wound that her family had carried for 3 generations, a wound of shame and unanswered questions, had finally, blessedly, closed. The decades of grief had been lifted, not erased, but transformed into a legacy of honor. Later that day, as she was packing her car to leave, her brother Mark approached her. He had been quiet since the town meeting, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a humbled, reflective silence. He stood there for a long moment, his hands in his pockets, searching for words. "I was wrong, Ellie," he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion she hadn't heard from him since they were children. "I was so afraid of the pain, I forgot to look for the truth. What you did, you gave Mom and Grandma the one thing they never had. You gave them peace." He pulled her into a hug, a clumsy, heartfelt embrace that healed a rift she had feared was permanent. In that moment, she understood that this journey hadn't just been about restoring her grandfather's name. It had been about healing her own family, about piecing back together the parts that had been broken by a 78-year-old lie. Driving away from Blackwood Creek, Ellie glanced in her rearview mirror. The town, once a symbol of decay and forgotten secrets, now looked different. It looked resilient. It had faced its own dark history and had emerged stronger, its identity reforged in the fire of a difficult truth. She thought about the nature of stories, how they can be twisted into weapons or polished into comfortable lies. But she also thought about their power to heal, to connect, to redeem. The official story, written by men in powerful positions, had nearly erased a good man from history. But the true story, preserved in the margins of a hymn book and in the pages of a diary, kept alive by the stubborn faith of a widow, had survived. It had waited patiently in the dark, for decades, for someone to have the courage to listen. The truth, she now knew, doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispers, and it surfaces, not always with the force of a tidal wave, but with the slow, inexorable power of a river carving its way through stone. It might take a lifetime, it might take 3. But eventually, no matter how long it takes, no matter how deeply it is buried, the truth finds its way to the light. And in doing so, it can redeem not just a family's memory, but the very soul of a town.